What I'm trying to identify is, do they have well-defined processes and procedures, or do they have ad hoc processes?
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Industrial Security Podcast. My name is Nate Nelson. I'm here with Andrew Ginter, the Vice President of Industrial Security at Waterfall Security Solutions. He's going to introduce the subject and the guest of our show today. Andrew, how's it going?
I'm very well, thank you, Nate. Our guest today is Darren Conway. He is the Cybersecurity Solutions Manager at Capula. And he's going to be talking about, defining industrial security programs, not just how we do industrial security, but why we do it and who does it, and sort of these higher level details that we don't often touch on.
Then without further ado, here's your conversation with Darren.
Hello, Darren, and welcome to the podcast. Before we get started, can you tell us a bit about yourself and about the good work that you're doing at Capula?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first off, I want to say thank you, Andrew, for having me on the podcast. I'm really interested in this series. As it relates to my experience and credentials for the last coming up on 20 years, I've had my CISSP around management programs. I also have the GICSP from SANS, which is more around OT-focused certification, and the CISA for a systems auditor, which I've been doing a lot of that work over the years. At Capula, we are a 50-plus year systems integrator specifically focused on the UK's critical national infrastructure, and primarily looking at power generation, transmission, distribution, water treatment, and things like that. And the work that I do is managing our cybersecurity professional services team and portfolio.
Our topic today is, policies, procedures, the documentation framework. It's the highest levels of security systems. And I confess, I've always been a little bit mystified by these. I mean, I've always imagined, you have to document the highest levels of the system, I suppose. But you get excited about this. Can you talk about, what is this world and how does it work?
It's important to understand that when we talk about a cybersecurity management system, really the framework that everything is built on is the policies and the procedures. Historically, I came from an IT world looking at ISO 27001, and within that documentation, there's really good direction on the different policies and procedures that you should have on hand and create and keep maintained. And as I moved over into the OT world and looking at some of the other frameworks, such as the IEC 62443, I was kind of surprised that it doesn't necessarily spell out what elements, what programs and activities should be documented. And then I kind of see this in my practical work as I'm going to different organizations, that there is to some degree a lack of this documented framework. I understand that engineers are, focused on keeping the plant up and running and things like this, and they're probably don't have the experience in these policies and procedures, but really for organizations, it's a bit of a blind spot.
So, that makes sense in theory. Can we talk about practice? Can you give me an example? What are we talking about here?
Ultimately, when I am doing advisory services for an organization, what I'm trying to identify is, do they have well-defined processes and procedures, or do they have ad hoc processes? And we could take an example, say, as it relates to being able to detect an attack. Do they have security monitoring in place, and IDS and SIEM? Those are all interesting as it relates to the technology that you put in place, but ultimately what I'm more concerned about is, what do you do with those? Do you have people who understand their roles and responsibilities as it relates to viewing those alerts? Do they understand when different alerts come in, how do we triage these? How do we respond to these? And ideally understand that these three alerts together create an incident, and then I move on to that procedure. So I think without the documented framework, it makes it very difficult when you're, again, working in ad hoc processes only.
Okay, so I mean that still sounds a little bit abstract. I mean, how detailed do you get with these things? I mean, how much paper are we talking if we're talking a document for a typical site?
Typically, we're looking at a hierarchy of documents. And so, as we, from a consulting perspective, help organizations either build out their cybersecurity management systems or fill gaps in there, one of the most important documents is the high level policy statements, which are the executive documents. And in the executive documents, the intent is not to say things such as we will encrypt with AES 256 or something like that. It's really something more similar to that we need to encrypt sensitive data in transit and at rest. Below that, typically you'll find the next section of documents under that might be standards. And standards is where we then get into more of the specifics of how we are going to accomplish the objectives that were set in the higher level policies. And so you do give more detail in here. So you might, in this set of documents, standards say that the approved encryption protocols are such and such. And, a really good reference for organizations who are looking to build out their standards might be the Center for Internet Security, and they have the CIS benchmarks. And within that, there's a number of different templates that organizations can use as starting points for building out their standards. And then also, you'd always recommend folks go to the vendors of the equipment as well. Oftentimes, you'll get some great guidance on your standards there. The next level of documentation below that could be guidelines. And first of all, when we talk about policies and standards, these are enforceable. These are things that you need to make sure are followed. But you could also publish guidelines, and guidelines are really focused more around best practices, such as don't use unsecured Wi-Fi hotspots and things like this. And perhaps if you are in an unsecured area, stand up the corporate VPN, things like that. And then the lowest level of documentation is procedures, and oftentimes procedures and standards, the term is used interchangeably, but just please, I guess, try and understand that procedures are really step-by-step guides for implementing the security controls or the different programs that you're doing. So we need to focus on two kind of areas. One, you're going to have programs, which are such as continuity, risk management, incident response, disaster recovery, things like that, and then life cycle elements. And so the life cycle elements are the things that you're doing more repeatedly, but you do want to have procedures for each of those programs and life cycle elements. And so I guess if we look back at my last example around security monitoring, folks are deploying things like real-time vulnerability management systems. And what we know, if you are under a cyber attack, the faster that you are able to respond to an attack, the less the impact of the attack is going to be. And so what the procedures are going to be as it relates to that IDS and SIEM and SOC monitoring and things like that is really how do we set up the different alerts and alert thresholds? What different playbooks do we have associated with those individual alerts and attack classifications? Who are the folks that are going to be doing this? What are the roles and the responsibilities for each people? And then practicing those things periodically by doing wargaming and muscle memories to build muscle memory on some of those different programs. But if you don't have those procedures in place, chances are you're not going to be able to stop the attack in a timely manner, and you're going to be probably looking at disaster recovery.
So Nate, just a word here. We're talking about policies, we're talking about procedures. The policies and standards, in my mind, these are things that you write down that are sort of what the company. What the company said, these are your goals. You will do X. Policies, if you break a policy or if you ignore a policy or a corporate standard for behavior, you risk disciplinary action. You risk getting fired. So, policies are sort of the very big picture. Everyone shall do X. The procedures are more about how you do stuff. And, to Darren's point, 62443 doesn't actually say you have to write down how to do all this stuff. It says you have to do all this stuff. You figure out how to do it, and the engineers do. But, when the technicians are doing their stuff day after day, and it's not written down, this is what's called sometimes tribal knowledge. It's knowledge of how to do things that's walking around in the heads of your employees. They've been trained, the PowerPoints have been put away, and now they do their stuff until they leave the organization and someone new comes in to replace them, or they get assigned to a different responsibility and someone else comes in to do the stuff they used to do. And now it's not written down. And so the new people have to figure this all out. Or, the other thing we see with without writing down the procedures is that the procedures drift over time. They change. Nobody's written it down. Nobody's tracking these changes. No engineer is deciding if these changes make any sense. This is the thing is, especially larger organizations that, persist over very long periods of time. You have to write this stuff down, or you really don't know what you wind up with a couple of years down the road.
Andrew, I understand what you're saying, but now that we're a few minutes into the podcast, in your intro, you were talking about, that this episode was about the why and the who of industrial security, sort of these big questions, and it feels like at least through the beginning of the interview, we're talking mostly about like policies and procedures. So I may be missing like the through line here.
Well, the policies are the why and the who. The procedures are the how. So, we did have a section here on procedures, but Darren is coming back to policy, and the policy talks about who has to do stuff and what they have to do, and often why they have to do it, why it's important to the organization, why people get fired if they don't do it. So we're coming back to that. So let's listen back to Darren. Okay, so you've given us the lay of the land. There's policies at the top, there's programs, and then we work down into standards and procedures. Can you give us some examples? I mean, let's start at the top, at the policy level. What do we see at that level?
Again, it's really for senior executives to identify specifically what are the objectives of the organization. And then the lower levels of the organization, the project management team, the engineers, folks like that, have more of the ability to go off and write the standards to say, how is it that we are going to achieve those objectives? Ultimately, we need the folks who are responsible for these controls to have ownership, and that's the executives in the organization. But then also the people who are implementing these individual technical controls and whatnot can use that policy to justify their actions and, to be quite frank, get the budget that they need to implement the technical controls as well. I have organizations that we work with, and again, we're quite often doing advisory services, helping people with the cybersecurity management system. And the last high-level executive policy document that we helped a customer write was probably around 12 pages of defining those objectives. And then as we got down into helping them with some of their lower level policy documents, such as what are the policy statements for the objectives of the OT side of the house, what are the objective statements for the IT side of the house, that got to be more detailed, and if I remember correctly, the last one that we did grew to around 60 pages in length. But ultimately, this is what gives the roadmap for the more technical people, the understanding of what it is that we're trying to achieve.
You just said the policies and the goals and objectives. These are, a policy is a policy. You have to do it. There's penalties if the people lower down in the organization don't follow policy. And so, when you set one of these goals and say, this is company policy, we're going to achieve this, there are budget implications. It sounds like you have to be fairly careful at the high level, not to say, I don't know, over-specify your policies, ask for the moon, because you're going to wind up paying for the moon. Do you run into this? How do you manage? How do you get the right policy?
So ideally, there will be multiple stakeholders involved in the drafting of these policies. And for the most part, this isn't something that the organization is making up. Generally, certainly in my industry and critical national infrastructure, this is a heavily regulated industry, and there are certain objectives that are regulated on the organization. And so when the executives are drafting these policies effectively, they've got a legal team and advisors who are looking at what are the regulations, what does this mean for our organization, and how is it that we can make sure that we're staying in compliance with these. Certainly, many regulated organizations, if in fact they don't show the due care and creating the policies and the due diligence in paying for the budget and enforcing and monitoring and auditing and all of those things, then the penalties can be quite high. So it's really typically we're talking about governance-driven statements that the organization is taking ownership of.
So Darren mentioned compliance. Let me say just a word about that. I was at a conference, face to face for the first time, since COVID. I've been to a couple of these now. A month ago, 2 months ago, I was leading a roundtable of CISOs talking about what motivates the business, what motivates the board, or other senior executives to spend money on industrial security. And one of the things that came up from one of the CISOs, and lots of heads nodding around the table, was compliance risk. Executives and the board tend to be directly involved with the very highest levels of the most material risks the organization faces. And often compliance risk is one of those risks. I mean, what I'm most familiar with is NERC-CIP in North America. The worst case penalty with NERC-CIP is if you do not comply with the standard. Worst case penalty is $1 million a day per day of non-compliance for every day you're not compliant. So it's a huge risk. And so it, in a sense, is not surprising that the lawyers and the executives get involved in making sure that the policy agrees with their compliance objectives and does not put them in risk of non-compliance with the regulations they have to obey. You also, I heard you touch on sort of the difference between OT policies and procedures, goals and objectives, and IT goals and objectives. Can you give us some examples? What do you typically see as different between the two?
So that is a great question, because it's very much similar technology that are used within both environments. But I think for that, I would contrast the difference between the ISO 27001 and the IEC 62443. And in each of those, they both have 13 major control areas. I think pretty sure it's 13. And what we see is those same controls are covered in both of the documents, but the priority of the controls are ranked in a different order, and that relates to the difference between the IT folks are more focused on confidentiality, integrity, availability, and OT folks are looking more at availability, integrity, and confidentiality. And so the two frameworks are written effectively covering the same controls, but in a different way, putting priority on different programs based on the different critical functions and the objectives of the organization.
So AIC versus CIA, you're right. There's a lot of that in 27001. There's even a lot of that in the original 62443 documents that are still on the books. 1-1 came out, talked all about that stuff. In my experience, though, in a sense, the the newer documents, I'm thinking, let's say the United States NIST 882, Revision 2 came out in 2016, 10 years after, almost 10 years after the first 62443 came out. And, NIST, talked about CIA, talked about AIC, but also talked about safety, about reliability, about critical infrastructures. Um, you know, can you talk about is the sort of are these high level concepts changing and evolving here?
I think yes. So again, when we look at the what they're doing with the NIST framework, that effectively what the approach that they've taken is to focus more on risk as opposed to the business impact of a cybersecurity event. So we're more worried about individual health and safety and these types of things, the safety of the plant's operations and secure operations. One thing that I do really like about what was introduced into the 62443, which isn't represented in the ISO 27000 series as it relates to your ability to more focus on risk, is your security target levels. So you can, based on your individual risks within the organization, you can create different security target levels for each of the different controls. And then you have different foundational requirements, enhancements based on your own internal risk assessment, or perhaps the risk assessment that you've done with the third party, things like that. And so you have much more granular control in the OT environment when we use that risk-based approach, as opposed to what we see in the ISO 27001.
Cyber attacks with physical consequences more than doubled in 2021. For industrial victims, the most common consequences were production outages at multiple sites. Most of the attacks were ransomware. And 2021 saw the first cloud-based ransomware attack. That attack compromised 1,500 businesses in the space of 45 minutes. These and other insights are included in a new threat report, co-authored by Waterfall Security Solutions and the new ICS Strive Industrial Incident Repository. For your copy of the report, please visit icsstrive.com. That's ICSSTRIVE.com.
Darren was talking about risk. He was talking about safety. One of he's talking about policy. One of the words that sort of connects all three of those concepts is tolerance for risk. So at the that CISO roundtable I was at, the CISOs told me one of the main jobs of senior management, board members, executives in a company, policy-wise, is to write down, to express in writing the risk tolerance of the organization. What kind of risks are acceptable to the organization and what kind are unacceptable, and there must be mechanisms in place to deal with.
Could you give me maybe a straightforward example of how this would look?
Yeah, I mean the classic sort of the textbook example is easy. It's the board or the executive team says in policy, the business by policy will suffer no more than 5 days of downtime in the case of a natural disaster that wipes out the head office. So, the head office burns to the ground. 5 days. That is a very clear direction to the business continuity team saying, oh, well then, we need a backup office somewhere. We need plans to move our people. If the office has burned to the ground, we need to move them to the new, they put all these plans in place. It triggers spending because you've expressed the tolerance very clearly.
The way you put it there sounds perfectly logical to me, but industrial security works with risks that are kind of out there, like, as you said, the burning down of a facility or like an explosion at a plant. These things don't happen quite as often as risks that are more common in other businesses, like dry seasons if you're in the food industry or whatever it is. So can you help me bridge between just how much these risks in industrial are like in our heads and theoretical and unlikely versus the practicality actually getting it on paper onto a policy?
That's a good question, and I wish I'd asked Darren that question, but a couple of examples spring to mind in terms of what's possible. Um, you know, my understanding is that in many organizations that I deal with at Waterfall, they have a policy something like no online attack from the IT network or the internet shall be able to put the safety of equipment or of workers at risk. What does that add up to? Well, online means connected. It means you have to air gap your safety systems. Okay, the safety systems might be networked to each other. They might be networked to a workstation on the desk of the plant operator beside all of the other 17 screens they're using, but they're not connected. And so that statement of policy says we will not accept anybody coming in from the internet and killing someone. It's unacceptable. Make it not happen. That's you can say very strong things like that. You can say more nebulous things. You could say the way 62443 describes the threat is you do your risk assessment and you decide what level of adversary you are going to design your defenses against. And so a policy statement might be, no adversary less than a nation state shall be able to damage equipment or, bring about other consequences, name the consequences. Another one is, look, we have larger assets. We want to be sort of in the middle of the herd or a little bit ahead of the middle of the herd when we're doing our cybersecurity programs. And so a policy statement might be something like over and above the required compliance measures, because everyone has to be complying with the law. No one wants to get sued. Over and above the compliance measures, we will apply all relevant best practices and all applicable guidance from government agencies to our security programs, our cybersecurity programs. And this means you're going to be ahead of the curve. If you're doing everything in best practice and everything the government is asking you to, even if it seems over and above best practice and all of it might seem over and above the minimum compliance, you're ahead of the middle of the pack. And that's by policy where you're saying you want to be. So these are sort of examples of my understanding of examples of policy statements that could express how much risk the business is willing to tolerate. You talked about policy documents. What's a typical procedures document look like? How long are these things?
I'm not sure I could answer that concisely because each of the different procedures can take on a life of their own. So ultimately, again, when we talk about procedures, we're talking about checklists and some of the different technical controls and programs that might need procedures might include a backup procedure, a patch management procedure, these types of things, or it could be a procedure around incident response. And an incident response procedure could have, many different scenarios and alert thresholds and response and recovery activities. So I don't think we can necessarily identify how long they should be. We just want to make sure that they're actionable. And that the folks who have the roles and responsibilities to carry out these different procedures understand that this is their role, what that responsibility is. So as it relates to driving awareness training when you first come in and continued awareness as you work with the organization. And many times, to be quite honest, I work with organizations who have third-party support agreements with the large vendors, and in that case, the procedure can be pretty darn short, which is, pick up the phone and contact the vendor.
I'm imagining sort of a wealth of knowledge being captured in policies and procedure documents. Who reads these documents? I mean, do we write these things and we put them on the shelf and they gather dust? I mean, obviously not. How do you use these things?
I remember recently being on a customer site, and they have a number of field engineers who have been with the organization for many years. And the obviously, we're working with technology that doesn't change a whole lot, and so they've got the muscle memory. They know what it is by heart to do these things. However, unfortunately, all of these things still need to be documented. Because ultimately, if you do lose one of your engineers, one way or another, you need to be able to get a new, engineer in there, and so folks need to follow those procedures. If you're in an incident response scenario and you've got someone within the organization who needs to follow procedures that isn't part of their primary function, certainly these need to be documented. And then earlier, when I referred to the term ad hoc processes, ultimately, if we're looking at an external or internal audit, they are definitely going to be looking for the documented procedures to ultimately say that what you're doing is repeatable, and I can see how it is that you're doing it. And then we can look at some of the other things around the checklists and other things to see that in fact it's being done.
So Nate, I'm compelled to tell a little story here. I remember, this was 20 years ago. I read an article that talked about it was, I don't know, operations research or something like that, and I went, what the heck is operations research? So I read this article, and it was an article about a complicated industrial facility. It might have been a power plant, it might have been something else, and the technician who was, approaching retirement had to be, they had to hire someone, bring someone else on, and they brought somebody in, and this new person just was not effective. So, fine, probation period, let them go, bring someone else in. Again, just not doing the job. What's going wrong here? They hired something like 3 engineers to come in and do the job of this technician. It was clear that something was wrong here. So they overspecified. They brought in, and the engineers together were not as effective at doing the job as the one technician. They kept going back to the technician. They couldn't seem to get the job. And so they brought in this operations researcher, I think that's what they called him, and followed the technician, followed the engineers around for a week or 10 days, and came back with a report and said, here's what's happening. These engineers don't have the deep knowledge of the plant that the technician does, but even the technician doesn't know it all or can't remember it all. Every time one of these engineers walks into the office of the technician, or taps the technician on the shoulder with a question that the technician doesn't know off the top of his head, he goes back to his office and he takes a clipboard off the wall. And there's 75 dog-eared pages of stuff clipped to this clipboard. And he flips through it and he gives the engineer the answer. My advice to the business is get that clipboard and photocopy everything on it and give it to the engineers. You have to document stuff. Nobody can remember it all. So, that's sort of what drives home the why do you need procedures, lesson for me. If you're doing an internal audit and external audit, these documents play a role. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as it relates to, again, my particular clients, we are typically talking about heavily regulated industries. And in, let's say, the UK, we have our competent authority is called Ofgem, which is the Office for Generation and Energy. And we are governed by a larger European regulation called the NIS, Network Information Security Regulation. The implementation of that NIS regulation is, again, carried out by the Ofgem here in the UK. So Ofgem will periodically do external audits against an organization. And when we look at the perspective from an external auditor, the auditor will look at all of your documents, your policies, what you say you're going to do, your procedures, how you say you're going to do them, and then also verification that these things are actually being conducted. So after you say rotate your backups, you document that those backups have been taken and rotated, and so they'll review all of those things. When we look at internal audit, it's a little bit different in that internal auditors typically they know what the policies are, and so they can go more down to the procedures and make sure that the procedures are still valid, and more specifically even the checklists and things like that, that folks are actually doing what it is they say they're going to do, so that they know when the next external audit comes that they won't have any surprises coming up.
Once you have a body of documentation like this, documenting your policies and your procedures, I imagine these things aren't completely static. Do they evolve over time? Do you get sort of called back in sort of repeatedly to these customers?
If I am in a customer site and I'm reviewing a policy or procedure or standard, one of the first thing that I look at on that document up near the change control section of the document is where it says the last time that it was reviewed. If I'm looking at a document that says it was last reviewed in 2012, I am not going to have a lot of confidence that that document is up to date. So there are a number of different scenarios where organizations might need to review or update the documents, but it is part of the standard that periodic review happens. However, you have the organizational decision to say, when are we going to do this? Are we going to review these annually, or perhaps up to, say, 3 years? But they shouldn't be any older than that without review. There are some different environmental factors that can impact an immediate change within the policies, standards, or procedures, such as a merger. Here in the UK, I've noticed that it's a bit of a fluid environment with folks, buying and selling different assets and different plants and whatnot. And when you have a major organizational change like that, that is definitely something that should trigger a policy review and standards and procedures to make sure that all of your different assets are governed under the same framework.
Stepping back a bit, I mean, we've been focused on sort of an organization doing their documentation, but I mean, you at Capula, you personally work with many organizations. You've seen many sort of iterations of these documents across different kinds of organizations. How similar are these documents between organizations? I mean, once you've done this job in one organization, does it go faster at sort of the next customer that sort of needs a similar set of documents produced?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I would say to some degree. So earlier, I had mentioned a couple of different resources available for starting points for organizations who are looking to beef up or build out their cybersecurity management system. And so I had referred to the Center for Internet Security, CIS benchmark templates. I had referred to the vendors who also provide some of the templates and starting points for these. And then also SANS. SANS has a lot of more of the standard and policy type documentation. And I think that there are a lot of similarities to how people achieve this objective of building out the documentation, but I want to also go back to my statement related to the fact that each organization needs to, following industry best practice, take a risk-based approach to the implementation of their cybersecurity management system, and each organization is going to do that completely differently. So if we look at our different critical assets and we look at the figuring out the priority of those different assets and things like things like that. Those are really going to be the drivers for the body of these standards. Some folks are, I dare say, truly air gapped. I've got a couple of customers who are pretty darn close to being still truly air gapped, and others aren't. There's just a lot of environmental factors and risk-based factors that will inform you as it relates to how individualized and personalized these different documents need to be. But they're definitely not cookie cutter. I couldn't lift and shift one organization's policies and standards and procedures over to another, and I probably wouldn't try.
Well, Darren, this has been good. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we let you go, is there a thought you'd like to leave with our listeners?
Well, Andrew, I guess first off, thank you again for having me. I really appreciate your time. So I think ultimately, again, based on my experience in going into customer sites, every week, I recognize as a challenge, and that's why I appreciate you bringing this up as a topic on the podcast. So organizations struggle with this, and as I think alluded to earlier, most of our customers are really, brilliant electrical engineers and focused on the operations, and perhaps don't have the experience related to incredible cybersecurity management programs and all of those elements. We at Capula, we work with folks constantly on helping define the programs through our advisory services so that we know when you're implementing the technical controls that you're going to put in place to protect your environment, that they're going to be done in such a way that is repeatable, measurable, actionable, and things like that. So I would just say if you as an organization don't necessarily feel that you have a strong set of policies and procedures, and you're not necessarily comfortable that when the auditors are coming to knock on your door that you're going to be able to show them, what it is that you say you're doing, how you're doing it, and that it's being done, I think it makes sense to reach out to external organizations such as Capula. We take a consultative approach really to come into the organization and for the extent of the engagement, become an extension of your organization, really focused on making sure that we're not just copying and pasting, different policies and documents, but that we understand specifically what are your business challenges? What are the risks that you have identified? What are the vulnerabilities, and what improvement plans do you have in place? And ultimately, you're looking probably for a solutions integrator to help you with that, as opposed to say the vendor of the product, because we just have a much more personal relationship with our customers. And again, thank you so much for your time.
Andrew, a final word on policies and procedures?
Sure. I mean, policies especially, policies document the important stuff. In a sense, it's obvious. All you document in policies is the important stuff. That's all they're about. They talk about who's responsible. We didn't discuss it much on the episode, but I imagine says, who is responsible for industrial security? Is it the IT team? Is it the engineering team? Is it the CISO? But to me, what's really important in terms of these policies is documenting the tolerance for risk. I mean, the bare minimum is you will comply with the law, or you risk, disciplinary action. This is, compliance is important. But industrial security is all about addressing risk. And so in my understanding, it's especially important in these policies to document how much risk the business is willing to accept, tolerate, live with, versus other kinds of risk that the organization is required to take off the table and required to ask for budget and allocate budget to address and take off the table. These are very important high-level decisions, and not always easy to capture. So it's good that we have people working on this.
All right. Well, with that, thanks to Darren Conway for speaking with you, Andrew. And as always, Andrew, thanks for speaking with me.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Nate.
This has been the Industrial Security Podcast from Waterfall. Thank you to everybody out there listening.